CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams joins me. I had the great pleasure of working with her for nearly 8 years at CBS. In her career, she's been based in Beijing before most recently coming to Istanbul, where she reported on everything from the emergence of ISIS in Iraq to the wars in Syria, Gaza, spent extensive time in Ukraine these past few years. Holly, I want to begin by saying, you've now spent a number of weeks in the lead up to the war, as well as the beginning of the war over the course of the past week. Talk to me about your observations and what you've seen in your experience there in Ukraine.
It's just very strange to see a country go from being, a fairly calm place to suddenly being a war zone. Not that Ukraine didn't have its challenges. They've had a war against Russian-backed separatists out east for years. People have a connection with that. They know people who are fighting out there. They've lost family members out there. They've been dealing with Russian aggression for many years. Russia already invaded Ukraine in Crimea in 2014. But for the most part, people were living very calm, peaceful existences. And most people we spoke to seemed to have a very clear conception of where their country should go, what they wanted their country to be. And a lot of Ukrainians were very worried about the situation, but also many of them said, we don't think it's a very big possibility that the Russians are going to invade. It's a possibility, we're anxious about it, but we're hoping this all comes to nothing. So it's a very strange experience seeing a country go from people living their normal lives to suddenly living in a war zone and not knowing what their future is going to be.
It was a really stunning contrast in the lead up to the war, because you saw Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, et cetera, say, they're going to invade, Putin's going to invade, and Zelensky and the Ukrainians be so dismissive of it. Were you surprised that Putin launched a full invasion? Why is it that you feel the Ukrainians dismissed it going into this?
Well, I don't know that they completely dismissed it. They talked about, that there was the distinct possibility of an escalation. But what we heard the Ukrainian government also saying was, please stop sowing panic, because panic is also really damaging to our country. It's really destabilizing. As for what we thought was going to happen, so much of this centers on Vladimir Putin and what his thinking was, and we don't know what his thinking is, and we don't know what it was. There's a whole sort of spectrum of possibilities that people talk about. First of all, how emotional is this for Vladimir Putin? How much is this kind of the former KGB agent who just wants to reestablish a kind of Russian empire at all costs? Or how much of this is more strategic, about thinking that he needs a sphere of influence, or that he's genuinely kind of fearful of NATO missiles? And I guess in the lead up, there was also kind of a range of possibilities. Was Vladimir Putin dead set on invading Ukraine at all costs, and the diplomacy that we saw was just a charade from his perspective? Or was it a kind of Cold War style game of brinkmanship, where he was looking like he wanted to invade while trying to sort of extract concessions from the West? So, so much in a situation like this, so much of that is speculation, because we don't know what Vladimir Putin is thinking.
What have you learned about the Ukrainian people through your reporting over the course of the past few years, and most significantly in the past week?
So this is a bit emotional. I have enormous admiration for their stoicism and determination. It's pretty clear, I think, that actually the impact of Russian aggression on Ukraine has been to clarify for many Ukrainian people what they actually want for their country and what they don't want. And I'm just so fearful for them. We've got to know a lot of people in Ukraine, and we've spent a lot of time on the front line out east, and spent time with soldiers out there, and they're young men and women, and they're obviously, civilians are in the firing line as well, seemingly, in Ukraine. But I wonder what's happened to a lot of those soldiers that we've spent time with.
As far as the reaction of the world, 200,000 people protesting in Berlin, or in support of Rican in Berlin, in Switzerland, in Sydney, in Buenos Aires, the global support. Did you get the sense, are Ukrainians, how are Ukrainians reacting to that? And at the end of the day, are they still, is there a feeling like, well, why can't you also put troops on the ground to support us here?
Yeah, I think both of those things from the Ukrainians that I've sort of interacted with. Yes, they're very happy that there's been an outpouring of support, but from the perspective of at least some Ukrainians, there's the feeling, yeah, why can't you do more for us? I think other Ukrainians would realize the thinking behind that from the perspective of the US and its allies, that getting involved militarily would turn this conflict into something potentially even more dangerous and explosive.
As far as the relationship Ukraine has with Russia, we obviously have heard Putin in recent weeks talk about, Ukraine isn't real, it's part of Russia, etc. As you've reported on Ukraine these past few years, and most recently this year, what's their feeling about the relationship with Russia versus Europe, and how has that evolved over time?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, although Vladimir Putin says that Ukraine is essentially a country that doesn't exist, Ukrainians seem pretty clear that their country exists. And what we hear, and polls reflect this as well in Ukraine, is that more and more Ukrainians over the years have decided that their future lies in Europe, that they don't want to be a country that is, they want peace with Russia, but that they don't want to be a country that's kind of tethered to Moscow, a puppet state, or even a country that has to think about Russia before it makes any kind of decision. So the polls show that more and more Ukrainians want to be part of the European Union and want to join NATO.
And as far as you spent some time with the Ukrainian military, obviously, Putin has been surprised, his forces have been surprised by how valiantly they have fought so far, especially coming off of 2014 in Crimea. What's your impression of the military training that you've witnessed, and whether they're going to be able to sustain this and hold off the Russian military?
Well, first of all, I should say I'm not a military expert. Clearly, people have been surprised. I would say perhaps not just Moscow, but some of Ukraine's friends and allies have been surprised at how determined the Ukrainians have been. I guess the difference is that they're fighting for their country. That tends to make people pretty determined when they have a clear goal and they feel strongly about it. And what we've seen as we've kind of driven across Ukraine in recent days is, well, first of all, there are checkpoints everywhere because there's now martial law. It's very understandable. That's normal. But for the most part, they're not manned by the military or the police. They're manned by volunteers, mainly by kind of local middle-aged men who've come out with what look to be their own guns and kind of an armband on. So, ordinary Ukrainians have really kind of sprung into action. As for how long Ukraine can hold off the Russian advance, I just don't know, because although they're very determined that they're outmanned by Russia, and ultimately that they're also outgunned.
There's a lot of people who are tuning in, especially in the US, to this conflict for the first time, learning about Ukraine and Russia for the first time. What do you think is the most important thing, or one of the more important things that Americans, and frankly, anyone around the world, needs to know to really understand what is going on there?
That's such a good question. I guess if you can do a little bit of reading about what happened in 2014, when Ukrainians kind of took to the streets, with this very clear idea about we don't see our future with Moscow. We see our future with the West. They ultimately toppled a pro-Moscow leader, and since then, Ukraine has gone in a very different direction. So I guess trying to understand that sort of recent period of history would be useful.
And as I got a couple of questions in terms of in the life of a foreign correspondent. You've covered, a wide swath of the world, and when it comes to wars, getting at the truth between the spin and now it's social media videos, etc., is challenging. How do you approach that? How do you approach? And I'm asking a very philosophical question here, Holly. Getting at the truth of what is taking place around you when there's so much fog.
Well, it's hard for a start, right? And I think any journalist has to acknowledge that. I think the best thing you can report as a journalist that's in the field is what you're seeing and what you're hearing, not trying to give people some fundamental truth about what's happening in the world, but saying, I was here today and I saw this transpire and I spoke to these people. And that's what they told me. You know, giving people back in the US, which is where our audience is for the most part, giving them a sense of what it is like, what it's like to be there. And of course, look, there are issues with social media videos, and we spend a lot of time trying to authenticate them, trying to geolocate them, trying to make sure that they are what we think they are before we ever put them on air. But I think in any event, the best reporting is somewhere where you actually, as a reporter, you take people somewhere yourself.
Personal question for you, and this is me asking. I've always been so impressed with your courage, Holly. You know, you were on the phone and you're in, you know, in the middle of Syria, the middle of Iraq, etc. And you're, you know, in Gaza, and you're going to these places where you're risking everything. Where is that courage from, Holly? Where does that come from?
I'm actually not a very courageous person, especially when I compare myself. I'm not a courageous person at all when I compare myself with the people that we meet on the ground who are genuinely on the front line, you know, with weapons, fighting for something that they believe in. I'm not a courageous person, and I'm very lucky. I work with amazing teams of people that I really trust, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to do things, planning about how we're going to do things, so that we can. I guess the idea is to take our audience as close as possible to what's happening, so they can get a real sense of what it's like there, what it feels to be like there. But the last thing we want to do is, you know, is be killed or injured.
And what do you think is unique about war reporting? I mean, you've reported a lot of conflicts, etc. What have you learned? What have you learned about people? What have you learned about this world, about yourself? You can take this any direction you want, from your experience reporting on these types of situations.
Well, I think at one level, reporting is reporting. It doesn't matter what kind of reporting it is. You're doing your best to try and sort of get the story right and take it home in a powerful way to your audience. I guess what I would say about war reporting is you go to places where people are having incredibly intense experiences, thinking in the people who are there, whether they're combatants or people who are living there, are thinking about what's important to them, and oftentimes fighting for what's important to them. And so that talking to people in that situation can often be very profound, and they often have very, very profound things to say.
And one thing looking ahead, given all you know, everything you've witnessed, what are you looking at? What are you watching in the coming days and weeks? What should people be looking out for as they watch what unfolds there?
Well, I think the fear that's been expressed by a lot of people is that if Russian ground forces can't do the job that Vladimir Putin seems to want them to do, that you know, he may resort to different types of weapons and use them in Ukrainian cities. So I guess that's the fear, and a lot of people are concerned that may happen.
And as far as you just mentioned Putin again, a lot of people have talked about that he's someone different, that he's doing some unpredictable, he's taking more risky, making more risky moves than he typically does. What have you observed in your reporting over the years, especially given that he kind of went full bore here with his invasion? What do you feel like something has changed? What's the sense you got when you talked to Ukrainian officials about what they were witnessing when it came to Putin?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think in the past we've seen the sort of things that Vladimir Putin has embarked upon involve taking small bites out of neighboring countries, and a lot of the kind of military things that he's got involved in have been perhaps lower risk, lower cost, and often with a strong element of kind of deniability. And I think that's not really the case here. It seems like a change for Vladimir Putin. I don't have any insight into that. Has something happened with him personally? I don't know, but I've certainly heard Ukrainians express the fear that he's not rational. And you can imagine how concerning that is for a Ukrainian. This is someone you're at war with, and they're fearful that he's not rational.
Holly, thank you. Stay safe.
Thanks, Mosh. Lovely to speak to you.